go. You awake?
Barely.
Kinda.
I'm here.
Okay. Not complaining. Let's see. Hale Center seems to be on vacation.
Can I be?
Got Post. Kind of. The Hoka seems to be the only people that are actually seated at their desks and all of that. They're already raring to go. Post is getting there. Hale Center doesn't seem to be with us.
Our bell just rang, and they don't trickle in till about 8.
Okay. I'm not making fun of anybody. It's kind of early in the morning to laugh, so I'm trying to figure out some way to make myself jovial and happy.
You can do it.
Painful, isn't it, guys? Just wait until you get my age, if you're that lucky or that unfortunate or however you look at it.
Lucky.
Huh?
Lucky.
Lucky? Okay.
If I'm
If you
alive
say
by
so.
then, if I survive long enough.
Oh, well, life is getting more and more difficult as we go along. Pardon our banter, I guess you guys out there can't hear the other half of the conversation. I'm chatting with the people in the front row here. I'm trying to think, it seems to me wow, are you already there? I'm not making fun of you. I don't see Hale Center. Everything else is working really well. Okay, thank you.
Professor Hunt, this is Hale Center. I'm going to reset our system to see if you'll be able to see us.
Okay, okay. Did you guys all everybody get their computer there? Okay. When we get done, just before you go out the door, I'll show you how to put up the Respondus lockdown browser if you don't have it on your computer.
The what?
The Respondus lockdown browser. It's how we take our exams.
Is it Proctorio?
No, I don't like Proctorio. We're here, I can see you, I don't need a camera to look at you. There they are. Whoops. No, they aren't. Somebody just... Post, you guys just moved from the right to the left. The Hoka moved from the left to the right. I wonder if this is a political thing. I also moved to the left, but I guarantee you that's not political. Hale Center is trying to reboot. what she was trying to tell me. As long as I've got Post and Hill Center prisoner for a while, are those your computers or are those the school's computers that you have with you? How many people are using a school computer that belongs to the school? Raise your hand. Okay. How many people are using Chromebooks? Okay. This lockdown browser that we have, you can get very easily. I'm going to send you a URL. You can use it on Chromebook, although Chromebook will tell you you can't. If you go into their little store for buying things, it's not there. But we give it to you, so you can get it off of our web link. And I will send you a URL. If you have an Apple type of computer, there's a special button to push for that. But you shouldn't have any trouble downloading this. You got Apple?
Chromebook.
Okay. Good. We can experiment with that. Make sure you don't have any trouble getting it downloaded. How about you guys?
We literally all have 3 different computers.
Huh?
It'll download, hopefully.
Oh yeah, well. Are you getting online yet? Are you online yet?
Yeah, I'm online.
Okay. We use that so I can certify the exams. I don't really like the other system they have. The one with the camera and the next thing they're gonna have them with like little diodes that you have to fasten to your finger and maybe a couple of little ones that you have to put on your head.
Yeah, like Proctorio is insane. Like you have to like show your room, like
Yeah.
and like
Yeah.
turn off your phone and
Well, what they're assuming is that you have an independent camera
yeah.
rather than the one that's attached
No,
to
you
your
can't have
computer.
anything attached. Like
Yeah.
it knows if
Yeah.
you have
Oh yeah, if you have any, it'll cut off all the other stuff.
like a monitor
Yeah, monitors and all
or
that.
cameras or anything. That's so lame.
So anyway, that's coming up. I have your keywords ready. I'm kind of 2 minds in it. I'm going to cut down on some of the terms that are in there. I'm going to eliminate some of them. It looks like a long list, and I don't want you to be intimidated by it, because a lot of the reason it looks long is I put some explanations next to a couple of things that I think maybe you might not be really strong on. That's not something that you're going to have to regurgitate to me during the exam or anything like that. But I will tell you this, you can study your own notes. In fact, you're allowed to bring into the room when you take the exam any handwritten notes you have. I don't care if it's a 30-page book, as long as it's written in your handwriting, you can bring it in. Nothing printed. I heard, well, Mr. Hunt, what if I type my notes? Nothing printed. Handwritten. There's a reason to this. Well, handwriting your notes means you just studied.
Yeah.
As painful as that might be. Okay, we left off. We'll talk a little bit more about this at the beginning of next week. My plan was to have the exam on this coming Friday, next Friday. It looks as though I'm going to have to put it off for 1 day, which means 1 weekend. I've got to get that organized. Some schools are having teachers' days and things like that next Friday. So, study like you're going to take the test on Friday. And in the meantime, we're going to get through the American Revolution, so you'll be ready. Another thing I will do, you guys have to remind me about this, because I have other things going on in my life too, but usually I turn on Collaborate Ultra and I'll explain that to you. I'll send you a URL eventually. And from about 6 until 8 on the night before the exam, this would be Sunday night if that's what it is, I'll just be sitting there on camera, and anybody that wants to participate in a discussion of anything they're studying or any questions they have, will share them. More people, but the more fun it is. Because then I can sit there and let you guys answer each other's questions. Sometimes I'll get 2 or 3 people out of 100, sometimes I'll get the whole 100. You just don't know. It depends on where the wind's blowing or who won the football game or something. I'm assuming Hill Center can hear me even though they don't appear on the screen. I'm hoping that's the case. At any rate, these morning classes are all recorded. I think you all realize that now. So you can always go back and look at a class if you missed something. If you don't know how to do that, I sent out a URL for that early on. If you don't know how to do that, I can send that out to you again. What you do is you use that URL and it will open up YouTube on our particular SBC page, and there'll be all the classes there. You have to go down to the bottom of the pile to get to the latest class. All right, where are we? What are we doing here? We were talking about what was happening after the French and Indian War concluded. The French are gone. The Indians are unhappy. We have Pontiac's rebellion, or Pontiac's war, if you want, which really didn't belong to Pontiac. He just did something one place and other Indians copied him. We talked about the British setting up a proclamation line following the proclamation of 1763, telling all the colonists you have to stay east of that line, the Indians can stay west of that line, and nobody liked it. The colonists were really angry about it. Why? Because land was always in their minds as their great ambition in life, and suddenly they were being shut off from the hope of getting land. The Indians didn't like it because they didn't like taking orders from anybody across the Atlantic or anybody else other than them, not in their culture. So I'm going to use, and you've got all of these, I think, in your notes in Unit 4.
Which one?
In the readings, you have names and faces and some other related things. I think in your lectures, you'll have American Revolution - Prelude. That's a shorter one. What I do is I broke up a really long one, and we can use that up to a point, and then we'll jump across to the next stage, which is first shots. We'll start out with the American Revolution Prelude. We talked about kind of the dirty linen at the end of 1763, Paxton Boys, things like that. Thomas Gage is in charge of British forces. Let me get this up here so you can see it on the screen. I'm going through them really fast. Number 6. We talked about irritations like admiralty courts, writs of assistance. Everybody remember that? You got it? Understand the writ of assistance. The part Americans didn't like was the part that was like an open search warrant.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay? And they really thought that was taking away their rights. And the admiralty courts, the big thing that they would complain about later is that it took away trial by jury. Because they were facing something like a court-martial, where the judges are also the juries. So these are irritants. And I think we were getting around to, and I think we actually started talking about the next Prime Minister of England. Maybe we talked about the Great Awakening. Did I get up here and give my sermon?
No.
Not yet. Okay, then let's talk about that. the Great Awakening. A lot of historians, thoughtful people, are going back and they're thinking about what was the real beginning of the American Revolution. Some people would say it was King George's War, where you started seeing two separate identities. Some people, including me, I think, come on, machine, function. By the way, welcome, Hale Center. We can see you on the screen now. Some people think it was this, the Great Awakening. This was in the churches. In the early 1700s, even before all these wars of empire that we just finished talking about were over, before some of them had been fought, some of the churches over in England and some of the churches in the American colonies are starting to feel like they're becoming a little bit irrelevant. I mean, people go to church on Sundays most of the time and all of that, but the church doesn't feel like they're connecting with the people. And some of the young ministers particularly feel this. The old guys don't care. They're like me. They just read the notes, right? And go on. But the young people are noticing that they're losing the minds of young people. And they think something's got to change. And I'm not sure that any one person said, we've got to do this, but people started trying to find ways to reach their congregation. And a lot of that had to do with how you delivered your sermon and what you actually said when you were standing behind the pulpit. In America, there was a fellow by the name of Jonathan Edwards. And he woke up his parishioners. I copied this out of a movie that I saw. It wasn't about Jonathan Edwards. It was a silly Walt Disney. It wasn't silly. It was a good Walt Disney movie called Pollyanna. And the preacher there was told he had to spice up his sermons. So he gets up behind, I haven't done this yet, he gets up behind the pulpit and he looks benignly at all of his people, and the little kids are playing in the aisles and things are going on, and boyfriends are looking at girlfriends and no one's paying much attention. Old people are sleeping. And he just leans over the pulpit and he looks at them, gets his breath, and he says, "Death comes unexpectedly. Change your ways or you will roast in hellfire for all eternity." Everyone freaks out. Believe it or not, that kind of delivery drew attention. And before long, people like Jonathan Edwards couldn't do it in a church anymore because the people that came to see and hear wouldn't fit in the church. And you start getting, as far as America is concerned, is the earliest of the revival meetings and that sort of thing. And it wasn't just one church. It was happening in a lot of them. A lot of the Calvinist types of churches, the Presbyterians and what have you, and a lot even in the Church of England, the Anglicans. Jonathan Edwards is the biggest name. I mean, you can tell what Jonathan Edwards was like just looking at the name of his most famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Whoa. I've got a couple people in this room that just woke up. They called these people that were trying to have a new approach the new lights. And they called the old stodgy people the old lights. Jonathan Edwards was a Congregationalist Protestant. But over in England, there was another minister in the Church of England by the name of George Whitefield. And he was a dynamic speaker. And he did the same thing as far as drawing attention. He wasn't exactly like Jonathan Edwards, but he got people's attention. He was invited to come over to Georgia by some church in Georgia. And he made a real hit over there. He even went and preached to the slaves, which surprised the people down there. He gets invited to come back to America again a second time. This time, he's kind of like a rock star. I mean, he's going to do a tour all the way from down south all the way up into New England. On the way through, he passes through Pennsylvania. Of all people, Benjamin Franklin comes to hear him preach. Benjamin Franklin, who was a deist, who believed that God created the earth and then disappeared, or went somewhere else and left the earth to take care of itself. So he didn't really believe in the things that George Whitefield was saying, but he was such a dynamic speaker that he decided he needed to go out and listen to him. And he actually allowed that while he wasn't particularly religious was a necessary thing for our country. So these are two of the people that did this. And the reason that we say maybe it's the beginning of the American Revolution is you're seeing an old style of approaching something being replaced by something new, a new beginning. And in a way, the mindset that leads to the American Revolution is just that. Some names and faces, and I'm not going to stay very long. Just before the French and Indian War ended, George II died. He's replaced by his grandson, George III. He'll be king already when they solve the French and Indian War in 1763. Henry Pelham, Thomas Pelham Jones, William Pitt, John Stuart, George Grenville, all of those guys are prime ministers of England, one after the other after the other. Why? Because they're starting to have trouble with the colonies and issues related to the colonies, and one after the other they're replaced because they can't do it. They can't solve whatever the problem is that they see in that. There's the old proclamation line. Admiralty courts. Writs of assistance. Okay. I know, I'm pretty sure we talked about this guy last time. Or maybe we talked about the guy when they were playing around with this is about to end, and so it interrupted us. George Grenville becomes Prime Minister about 1763, I want to say. And he's going to change how taxes are done in the Americas. In 1764, he gets two acts passed through Parliament. One is the Revenue Act. Sometimes in our little golden book of history, they call that the Sugar Act, or the Sugar Tax. The other one is the Currency Act. They're a lot more complicated than it says in the little golden book of history. The Revenue Act was about a whole bunch of commodities, not just sugar. And that tax, the tax that they established under that act, was actually lower than the original, than the ongoing sugar tax. And yet, the big merchants were very, very unhappy about it. Now, why would you be unhappy if someone changed the tax and made it a lower tax? Doesn't seem to make sense, does it? Well, the fact of the matter was that regardless of whatever tax was that they had before, the American merchants just weren't paying it. But now the French and Indian War is over with, and the British have a navy with nothing to do, and they're going to be able to enforce the tax laws and prevent smuggling. That's what the merchants were screaming about, wasn't the tax rate. And making it worse for them, they passed this Currency Act. Now, you have to understand, in the early days of our country, in fact, almost all the way up to the Civil War, we didn't have a really standard monetary policy. And a lot of different people could issue some kind of paper that was worth money. Big merchants, banks, they all kind of put out their own kind of money. And people would accept it because it did have value. The Currency Act says when you pay your taxes, when you pay your import duties, you have to use hard money. Now, hard money is money that's actually backed by, it's either silver or gold itself, or it's money, it's paper money that's backed by silver or gold. exchangeable for silver and gold. Well, the people that are paying these taxes are the big merchants. They weren't happy about this. They complained about this really loudly. And you had to think, well, look, why is John Hancock complaining about the Revenue Act and the Currency Act? He's got enough money. He's one of the wealthiest men in the world. Why can't he pay the tax in cash? What's so hard about that? Then you have to think, why would he complain about that? Well, it all has to do with what he needed the cash for. He didn't want to send his cash to England because he had another use for it. What kind of transactions do you have to have cash for? Yeah. Yeah. We have a lot of problems sometimes in class because students come up with ideas that we're not supposed to mention in class, but we can describe it as illegal transactions. And that's why they needed the cash, because they were doing a lot of illegal business down in the Caribbean and other places like that, buying things outside the system that they weren't supposed to go outside of. And they didn't want to lose their cash. Does this bother the man on the street? The man on the street doesn't know anything about it. What does he care? If he wants food, he brings 2 pigs under his arms, walks down to the market and swaps them for a bag of sugar or whatever. Or takes an IOU someone else gave him and exchanges that for whatever he needs to buy. He doesn't care. So we call those indirect taxes, because they don't affect everyone, just a certain group of people in a certain walk of life. So far, so good. He's ticked off the merchants, but they'll get over it. But then he makes a really bad mistake, and I use this expression too often, but he shoots himself right through the foot. He may have shot himself through both feet. It's called the Stamp Act. It's not about postage stamps, guys. And you may laugh when I say that, but invariably on exams, someone thinks it's about mailing stuff. The Stamp Act is about officially taxed paper. If you have official documents like a deed, birth certificate, death certificate, bill of sale, even playing cards, even newspapers, tax has to be paid on that paper. This is going to affect everyone. It's not just big businessmen. It's a double mistake. And I'll tell you the other half of the double mistake. It's going to bring people out on the streets. It's going to cause the first actual violent reaction to acts of Parliament in the colonies. Down in Virginia, the House of Burgesses has a meeting to discuss it. They're going to pass resolutions condemning it. A young man by the name of Patrick Henry is going to get up on a podium and sound off about it. They pass resolutions, which they mail copies of back to England, saying you're violating our rights as Englishmen. Up in Massachusetts, they send a letter to all their neighbors up there saying, we need to get together and talk about this. They eventually meet down in New York. There, by the way, is a kind of romantic picture of Patrick Henry emoting his speech before the House of Burgesses. They do the Virginia Resolves. You can look at the substance of them. They don't just complain about the Stamp Act. They also complain about things like having trials without juries. They add that in there. They're still upset about the Admiralty Court, so will continue to be upset by them. The Stamp Act Congress happens in New York City in October of 1765. How many people participate? Well, the leader of the Stamp Act Congress was a guy named James Otis. He was a lawyer and a pamphleteer. He was the guy that published a lot of little short political things, printed material, like the rights of British colonies, et cetera, he wrote that in 1764. Participants in the Congress, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina. Don't know why North Carolina didn't come. I know why Georgia didn't come, because it was too far away. I know that Virginia didn't come because they figured they'd already done this with their resolutions. They issue the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. They're going to fold that baby up, put it in an envelope, and send it to the king or to Parliament. They declare that taxes imposed on British colonists without their formal consent were illegal. Something they don't say in your little golden book of history, and something they don't even say, I think, in our history book is, that sounds really terrible, taxation without representation. But the English people said, what are you beating about? It's the same way here. Because you see, about 1% of all the males in England had a vote. 1%. Was that representation?
No.
So that, what are these Americans belly aching about? They didn't understand. The Declaration of Rights and Grievances covers a whole gamut of things that the colonists don't like. This has brought them, the Stamp Act has got them into action to complain about that problem and many others. You get organizations like the Sons of Liberty. I like the Liberty Tree. You know the whole story about the Liberty Tree? I mean, it's gone. I think it's finally gone. They tried to preserve it for years. There was a tree in Boston, and what you did was, if you had things to say about Parliament or the British, you wrote them down and you hung them on the tree like a Christmas ornament. One way of, letting off steam, I suppose. I'm sure that the royal governor didn't go down there and read the tree every day. They also started boycotting some British goods. Strangely enough, sympathy for them came from the British merchants over in England, because they're losing money if business with the Americans is interrupted. Big mistake. People were getting violent, chasing tax collectors around, throwing rocks through the windows of the royal governor. At one stage, a little bit later on, they're actually going to break into his house and destroy the furniture on at least the lower level, loot his house. He and his family had to go into hiding, which is really sad. He's an American too. Just happened to be working for the English government. And he was a fairly reasonable man. Thomas Hutchinson was. He had told, when he heard about the Stamp Act, he told his representatives in England, don't do it. It's going to be trouble. He told them that about some of the other things, like the Admiralty courts too. Nobody was listening to it. 1765 was the Stamp Act. 1766, after all the brouhaha and the smoke and screaming and fighting, the British repealed the Stamp Act. They left some of the other taxes in effect, but they repealed the Stamp Act. By the way, Prime Minister Grenville got fired for this grievous error, and a fellow by the name of Watson Wentworth, Lord Rockingham, took over as Prime Minister. He'll only last a year. Think about repealing that. This was the second part of the big mistake of the Stamp Act. Mothers and fathers, and most of you are way too young to worry about it right now, but mothers and fathers learn quickly about the greatest mistake you can make when you raise a child. And that great mistake is letting a child learn that all he has to do is lie down on the ground, kick, scream, and yell and make noise, and he'll get what he wants. And yet, Britain was just teaching the colonies that very thing. They screamed, yelled, made noise, and Britain repealed the act. Once you do that, you're fighting a lost cause. So in a way, you could say the Stamp Act was the beginning and kind of the end of any chance of ever resolving differences between the colonies and England, even though it'll be a long time before the revolution actually happens. They made it even worse, or almost comical. I know you've had a fight with somebody that's close to you, and you run out of reasons that your side is right, and you end up going, oh yeah? That was the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act basically said, you don't even need to read the notes, it basically said, just because we repeal that act doesn't mean we'll do it every time, doesn't mean we have to, doesn't mean we don't have the right to pass laws about you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course all the colonists did was laugh about it. Doesn't care about the Declaratory Act. Out goes Lord Rockingham, in comes William Pitt as the Prime Minister. I'll show you this chart again somewhere along the line. Those are all the Prime Ministers they went through. In a parliamentary government, if you don't do the job right, they vote no confidence and you're out. We're going to end up with Frederick North when the American Revolution starts. Over in Britain, there were two political parties, the Whigs and the Tories. It's hard to compare them to modern day parties, but the Whigs were the ones that were a little bit more moderate about these things, and they tended to sympathize with the colonies. The Tories were hardliners. The King's friends were Tories that happened to be close to the King. He's going to eventually, when he runs out of Whig prime ministers, he's going to pick a guy he knows personally and push him for prime minister. For the time being, though, William Pitt, first Earl of Chatham, will become the prime minister. He's got a lot of experience, and throughout this entire period, he's one of the most influential men. Even if he's out of office, he'll be one of the most influential men in the British Parliament. He's going to appoint kind of what we call a Secretary of the Treasury, but in England they call it the Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is the guy that plans out the annual budget, where they're going to get their money, all of those things, and presents that to the Prime Minister, who can present it to Parliament. He's got a little bit more power than our Secretary of the Treasury has. And of course, generally speaking, these guys are all members of Parliament, so they know all the other people in the Parliament. He comes out with a program. We'll call it the Townsend Program. One of them is the New York Restraining Act. Now, New York was angry about a lot of things besides the Stamp Act. One of them was that during the French and Indian War, New York and some of the other provinces were required to help with the housing of British soldiers, because the Brits came over from England and they didn't have any bases or anything like that, so the local economy was supposed to help them out. They called it Quartering Acts, and they had to make some kind of space available for the British soldiers and the British officers to live. And New York was refusing to do it. Pennsylvania wasn't so bad, Virginia helped out, but New York just wanted nothing to do with that. So they passed this New York Restraining Act, partly because they'd been the hosts of the Stamp Act Congress, and partly because they wouldn't go along with the Quartering Acts. And they told them, when you start complying with the law, your legislature can meet again, but until then, you may not meet. So basically, they're taking their local assembly away from them. They passed another Revenue Act, and it was about indirect rather than direct taxes. I'm not going to do another Stamp Act. Some of the things are already being taxed. They're going to change the tax rates. but they're going to include things like glass, lead, paint, paper, tea, all of those things are included under this. And it also establishes a board of customs which will be based in Boston. And the Americans really didn't like that. This is sending a bunch of Englishmen over to help ensure the taxes are collected. They didn't like that. And an interesting thing is going to happen. There's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Up until this time, you've got two kinds of people complaining, really. You've got some of the wealthy businessmen, not all of them, but some of them like John Hancock complaining. And you've got, maybe we could say, the more radical members of our society out on the streets complaining. The people who would tend to bring their complaints out to the streets. The other people are so busy just making a living, they don't want to get into conflict, they don't want to stick their nose into that. But somewhere around the time that Townsend passed his Revenue Act, it pushed some people off the fence. And you get this kind of mild, very moderate kind of complaint from people, nowadays we call them the silent majority. And the best example of that was Letters of a Farmer in Pennsylvania. It was a series of letters written anonymously to a newspaper in Philadelphia. I think most people knew who it was coming from, but they were written by lawyer and legislator John Dickinson. And he just, in a moderated tone, discusses the reason for taxes and tariffs and brings up the point that the British are using it for the wrong purposes. Taxes and tariffs, he argues, are only to regulate trade, not to raise massive amounts of money. And towards the end of the series of letters, he finally comes out and gets just a little bit more extreme than he'd been before. Listen to the words. They're not that hard to understand, but if at length it becomes undoubtable that there is resolution formed to annihilate the liberties of the governed, take away our freedoms, in other words, English history affords, that means offers, frequent examples of resistance by force. And it did, of course. I mean, just ask Charles I. What happened if the English people got upset with what he was doing? He was shortened by a head. That's pretty extreme if you're talking about it coming from a moderate and not a radical person. So it shows a change in this process of thought. More people are becoming involved in disputing what the British are doing. Certainly not all the Americans, but more. Somewhere along the line, as these protests got pretty raucous, like tarring and feathering taxmen, marching them out of town, that's a kind of a nasty thing where you take somebody's clothes off, spread sticky stuff all over them, and then pile feathers on them, so it looks like a giant bird. Then you tie them to a pole like you would a dead animal that you'd hunted for, and you march them through town and drop them off somewhere out in town, and they can figure their own way to get home. It's better than killing them, but not much. They were doing things like that. General Gates decided it was his responsibility to maintain order. He's the commander of all British forces up there. He happens to live in Boston, and he suggests we need to bring two of the regiments that we still have here in close to Boston to maintain the peace. He made a little bit of a mistake there. He was a little bit insensitive. The Crown said it's all right to do that. He brought one in and actually put them in barracks in the town. I think the other regiment stayed on ships in Boston Harbor. But he brought in a regiment that was famous for being unruly and undisciplined. During the French and Indian War, they weren't very discriminate. Whatever town they passed through, they stole everything they could get their hands on. even if they were supposedly a friendly town. And that really, really upset the people of Boston. So now you've got, for a number of years, you're gonna have the situation where there's fights in the pubs. Some pubs won't serve British soldiers, some pubs will only serve British soldiers. Sometimes British soldiers walk into the wrong pub and there'll be fights and things like that. Sometimes people will be accosted in the street. They wanted to maintain order for that reason. And to some extent it worked. We're working our way through the 1760s. We're up to 1768 when that happened. In May of 1768, one of John Hancock's ships got caught smuggling. It's called the Liberty Affair. He's brought to court about this, but he's a wealthy man and he's got really good lawyers, and they tie the court in knots. And the case drags on and on and on, and finally the British prosecutors just give up. Virginia is kind of starting to come to a boil. They issue more complaints, more Virginia resolves, they call them. The Prime Minister, Pitt, kind of gives up. He's replaced by a member of the King's Friends, a hardliner by the name of Lord North. That was his title, and what people called him in general. That happens in 1769. In 1770, early in the year, while the snow is still on the ground, there is an incident in Boston that we call the Boston Massacre. Between you and me, my numbers for massacres are a little bit higher than the number of people that were killed in the Boston Massacre. But of course, even nowadays, journalists like to make things bigger because they can sell more newspapers. In this case, there were 5 people killed by British soldiers. There was a mob that formed around some young British soldiers. You have to understand British soldiers. Put yourself in their place. You have to look at both sides of the story. It's cold. It's miserable. Most of the people that would be standing guard would be 17 years old, maybe 18 years old, far away from mom and dad, in a place where people don't like you, no girls that will go out with you, that sort of thing. It's a rough life. They have to stand at rigid attention in front of the places they're guarding. They can't react to people walking by. And the people walking by did what they could to make them react, get them in trouble. Occasional snowball, maybe a rock, bad words, things like that. At any rate, one day, during the changing of the guard, where one group of guards was going to be relieved so they could go get warm, and the other group came out, someone fired a weapon. There was a gathering of people there. It's hard to say if they were the Sons of Liberty, if it was like a flash mob, what it was. Someone fired a weapon. We still don't know whether it was an Englishman. Well, they're all Englishmen. We don't know if it was a military man or it was a civilian or what. But a weapon went off, and these young soldiers were rattled. They heard a gun go off. They assumed that the order had been given to fire. There was too much noise to really hear. And so they opened fire. Now these are muskets, so they're only going to be able to fire one round, and 5 people were killed, including Crispus Attucks, the first African American to die, if you want to call this part of the American Revolution, and the first African American to die in the American Revolution. I used to think he was just an innocent bystander or a walker by, passerby, but he was actually a member of the Sons of Liberty. Not Patrick Henry. Samuel Adams, I mean, almost as fast as this happened, had someone do an etching. It's like a painting, but it's etched into metal so you can print it. Had someone do an etching of the Boston Massacre. And it spread all over the colonies. He was a real rabble-rouser. He was good at it. And he wasn't a lot of people paint him as a lightweight. He wasn't. Later on, he served as governor of Massachusetts for 2 terms. But he was pretty radical. And all these British soldiers are going to be brought to trial. They're going to be arrested. by the British Army, put on trial in a Boston court. The question is, who will be their defense? And of course, all the American lawyers are going, I won't get anywhere near this. You know, it would ruin my reputation, it would ruin my career. Nah, I'm not defending those British soldiers. But one man stepped forward, and he said, every man deserves a defense, regardless. His friend said, don't do it. Don't do it. This is your ruination. His wife wasn't really happy about it. There were threats and things like that. But he insisted on defending the British soldiers. And what happened in court was that each witness's testimony was different from every other witness's testimony. So there wasn't a whole lot of proof. Almost everybody got off. The officers who were charged, the sergeant that was there was off. Two of the guards were found guilty of a lesser offense. They had their thumbs branded. I have no idea what that amounted to. Apparently it wasn't nice. But they all got off. Who was the guy that defended them? A man of high principle. This is like Trivial Pursuits. I'll keep giving you more hints until you figure it out. He later became President of the United States.
George Washington.
He wasn't a lawyer.
Oh.
He was a plantation and a surveyor. Who did it? Samuel Adams, the second President of the United States, actually manned up and defended these guys and did a good job. It didn't make the colonists all that happy. And, of course, people like Samuel Adams were painting the flames for all it's worth. There's that Liberty Affair. I just wanted to show you, too, this is Thomas Hutchinson. He was the governor. He participated in the Albany Congress way back during the French and Indian, at the beginning of the French and Indian War. He was the Chief Justice of Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. That's still what they call it. All-American guy. When the English nominated him to be royal governor, he recommended against the Sugar Act. Said, that's a bad idea. When they decided on the Stamp Act, he sent him another message. Don't do that. You don't know what's going to happen. You'll lose more than you gain. They didn't listen to him. And he stuck with the job. And he's going to become the target of the Americans like Sam Adams because he's the symbol of the British authority there. Must not have been a very pleasant time for him. There's the prime ministers again. There's Lord North. Frederick North is his real name. He takes over in 1770, not long after the Boston Massacre. What else happened after the Boston Massacre? There's Thomas Gage. We'll talk about him in a minute. Less than a month after the Boston Massacre, Parliament's going to repeal most of the Townshend Acts. Uh-oh, we're doing it again, backing down. Bad idea. I mean, from the point of view of if you wanted to dominate, bad idea. A couple years go by, this is just kind of bubbling. A lot of it's in Massachusetts, a lot of it in Boston, quite a bit in New York because of the actions taken against them by the Crown, and Virginia because they just tend to be that way. We're also talking about things, but most people, the average man on the street, still scratching the ground to make a living. But as time goes by in the 1770s, it's one side does something wrong, then the other side does something wrong, back and forth, and tensions continue to grow. For example, there's the Gaspé, the story of the Gaspé. His Majesty's ship, His Majesty's cutter, Gaspé. It was a small two-masted ship. It was a customs cutter. It was to catch smugglers. And the young captain of the ship was sitting there on post. And a boat goes by that looks like looks a little bit suspicious to him. It's a very lightweight craft with a single mast, single big sail. And so they fire off a warning shot, heave to so we can inspect your boat. And instead of slowing down, they just put on more sail and go faster. And so he goes after them with his cutter. And this is a lightweight little boat, and he goes scooting up into Narragansett Harbor, down where Rhode Island is now. That's where the incident happened. And he goes over some sandbanks because he's a very shallow draft boat. And that cutter slams right into the sandbanks. They're underwater, you can't see him. He's moving pretty fast. Sailboats don't have brakes. And he snapped off his masts. Because when a boat stops, the masts are heavy, they've got sails pulling them, and they want to keep going. So I had to get some help and put this cutter up along shore. And then had to send messengers out to get replacements for the masts and get repairs done. And while most of the crew and the captain of the ship were at a local pub, I think, on shore, someone looked out the window and their ship was on fire. My. And they came running back, and by the time they got there, it was too late. The ship was burned to the waterline. They don't know where the guy that was on watch went. And so the British started asking around what happened. They started investigating. Finally, they're going to have a commission to investigate. I don't know. Maybe it was lightning. Or maybe wind blew a lantern over. Or maybe the watchman was smoking. Whatever. And they started going around trying to ask people, and nobody knew anything, strangely enough. It's kind of like the poor police.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
According to my clock, it's 8:41. We're getting this machine abbreviating us. What time does yours have?
8:52.
This clock's wrong then. Okay. That clock's wrong. That's 8:53. At any rate, they never found out who did it. We know who did it later on. A guy named Abraham Whipple and a guy named John Brown took a bunch of their buddies, sailed over, or rowed over to the ship, did something to the guard. They didn't kill him, but they got rid of him, stole everything they could off the ship, set it on fire. Never got caught. There's another action that's really upsetting the British. Virginia, that same year, or the year after, sends out a proposition to all the colonies, let's form communications. They actually called them committees of correspondence. There were little committees that were responsible for communicating between the colonies. We're kind of out of time. This may turn off, but another thing happened in 1773. The British East India Company started going broke. Nowadays we have a modern day term we call too large to fail. They're companies that we can't let go under because they would damage our economy. The British East India Company was exactly that. Mainly the tea trade. They were going broke. Lord North has to figure out some way to stop that from happening. So he gives them permission not to bring their tea to England before
Your
it goes to
conference is
America.
now over. Goodbye.
We'll continue on next time. And on there it says 1 minute remaining, but we've already lost the schools. No, take that back. On this thing, we're on time. So, I was wrong. It's hard to tell because you look at this thing and it says it's 8:44 a.m.
Yeah.
On this thing it says 8:55. It's actually 8:55, so we're 5 minutes over. I don't. Can't complain. I guess I can, but it doesn't do any good. Take care.